Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Julie's Orchids. So I thought we'd share another Saturday morning watering routine and give you an idea of the amount of work it is sometimes to take care of your orchids. It is a lot of work, but it's quite worth it. Now, another thing that makes taking care of the orchids on a Saturday morning before everyone in the house wakes up is a good cup of coffee. And I cannot express anything other than this cup that I got here from Ninja Orchid Store with her Brassavola Digbyana line. I've had for quite some time now, and it's my everyday coffee cup. This is my coffee cup that I take to work in the morning with me, and it's a nice big one, and it has plenty of room for all of the coffee that your body might need to get you through your morning at work or your morning at home. As you can see, I've had it for a while. Some of the markings are coming off, but I don't mind because our Brassavola Digbyana is still here. It's a nice metal cup, keeps my coffee nice and warm, and it keeps me well caffeinated. Look at what I've got going on. Brassia Shelob Okia. This would be my plant's first flower spike. Just look at this new root growth since we've put it into pumice. As I mentioned, I waited until I saw new roots sprouting, and they are loving the pumice. Again, I'd like to point out new root growth heading down into the pumice on my species Oncidium liridium, or the mule ear orchid. This one has yet to flower for me, but I'm hoping maybe this year we'll get something. One of the flask babies. Sorry, the night light's not the best, but we've got a new little leaf growing here. And this is how I water them. Now this is in a semi-hydro, but you can see it's drank all of its fluid. I'm going to put the holes so they're in the water level. And then all I'm going to do is pour the water in here until it gets most all of the pumice wet. And again, I am avoiding getting it in the crown or in the leaf joins right here, because that can cause rot. And so this is what I do for all of my orchids. They come to the sink, they get their little drink, and then they sit on the side of the sink and drain before they head back to their home on the shelves. Now in the smaller cups, because the water level is too high, and I do find that these small cups with the smallest size pumice stone don't really need the soak as much. And I will fill these up again, blocking the holes with my hand, and just let them drain out. And then we'll put them over here to finish draining. Now these little guys are going to sit here for the next 20 minutes or so, and then they'll drain, sit on the table until it's time for them to go back on the shelves. What I do is I do these smaller cups first, because the next size larger pots will need more water. So I'll just add more water to here. Now today is just water day. Today is not fertilize, nor is it CalMag day. It's just water and sort of rinsing any buildup salt residues off of everything. And so I am taking all of the plants in these size containers, are the smaller ones, and they're going to go through this round. And now, because this is just water, what I am going to do because it's also watering day outside, I'm probably going to do 2 more buckets full, and then I'm going to take this water out to the front garden, and I'm going to use it as what we reference as gray water, not fit for human consumption, but perfectly fine for plants outside. It's starting to get warm here. We're having a lot of strange weather fluctuations. Friday we had 37 degrees, bright sunshine, and then yesterday it was kind of cold by comparison at 24, and we had rain, and it's not the time of year for rain. We shouldn't be getting it now. Normally Perth has summers with just 0 rain at all. And then you head into fall, and about midway through fall, we start getting the rainy season. And then it'll rain through fall and winter and part of spring. And then spring it dries up, and then no more rain until fall. I believe what we're experiencing is a double La Nina event here in Australia. Boy, it's making the weather really crazy. I'm not sure, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've been living in Australia now for about 10 years. I've noticed a change in the seasonal patterns in the 10 years that I've been here, and I've spoken to a lot of my Australian friends, and they're saying that yes, the weather patterns are changing. So I don't know if that's for the good or for the bad, but we're dealing with it. Now, I'm in Western Australia, and you're thinking, why am I reusing all of my water? For a couple of reasons. This is a kind of almost desert-like climate, so for, I'm going to say, a good half the year, we normally don't get any rain, and it's normally very dry with very little to 0 ambient humidity in the air. So water is a precious and scarce resource sometimes here in WA. So there's a lot of water savings and things that go on. And I try to help out by reusing as much of my water as possible. Now, I do not use my regular tap water to water my orchids. I have a 3-way splitter tap at my kitchen sink, which is why we do this in the kitchen, which gives me access to water straight from the mains or my RO water. Now, why do I do this? Well, because here in Western Australia, in my area where I live, the parts per million on my tap water are 485 parts per million, and that is far too much for orchids. And if you use the tap water at 485 parts per million, and then you try to fertilize, well, then you're getting your plants up to 600, 700, 800 parts per million, and you get a lot of, well, burned and dead roots and unhappy plants. I've noticed since swapping from straight tap water to my Brita filter pitcher, that brought the parts per million down to about 300. And I was doing that for the first, year or so, and was just really struggling with salt buildup on my media, and the plants weren't liking it. So about a year ago, I bought an RO water system. And in that year's time, I've seen such a big difference in the health of my plants and their ability to put out roots, and those new roots not getting burned from the salt layer buildup on top of the media, that they've just really started to thrive since I switched over to reverse osmosis water. And my reverse osmosis system takes my water down to about 12 parts per million. And then I add, depending on the watering cycle and the growth season. So in spring and summer, when they're very actively growing, or the plants that grow all year round, when they're very actively growing, I will fertilize and I will give them CalMag. And I do that sort of weekly. So the first week of the month, they'll get fertilizer with CalMag, and I'll give them the fertilizer, which is the Thrive I've showed before. And I'll bring the parts per million up to about 100, 120. And then when I add the CalMag, I'll bump that up to about 170, unless I'm doing my Phragmipediums and my slipper orchids, in which case they get very low levels, which I jokingly like to reference as they get homeopathic levels. So the frags in the past will get a brand new mixture when I'm doing the fertilizing, and their total parts per million when I'm doing the fertilizer and the CalMag will not exceed 120 parts per million for both. They don't need a lot of fertilizer. They suffer leaf tip dieback very, very quickly. And those two genres of orchids do not get the fertilizer every time. They get it once a month. They just don't need it. Even when they're in active growth, they really balk if you give them far too much fertilizer. So these little guys are just going to sit here, and as you can see where my water level is, it's not all the way up to the top. And these are all in the semi-hydro setup, so when I pull them out, you just let them drain like that. But this sort of setup lets and this watering technique lets the water come up, and then I poured the water over the top of the pumice to get the top a bit wet. And then I'm just going to let it soak, like I said, for about 20 minutes so that they can really soak up all the good moisture, the roots can, and then we let them drain out and sit on the sink over there. Now, like I said, I've got multiple different sizes of pots, so it depends on the water level, and I do this while my family is asleep because I end up taking up the entirety of the kitchen and most of the dining area. And with this taking up the entirety of the kitchen and most of the dining area, it's very difficult for my family to eat breakfast. So I have to get up early in the morning and get all of this done before they're up and around and trying to get their breakfast going, because I'm in their way. It's difficult. My house is quite small. I don't have a tiny house. You can't put it on a truck and move it around. But as you can see, it's more like a nice-sized apartment as opposed to a big house. I designed and built this house about 6 years ago because it's just me and my husband. We don't have really little kids, and do we really need a huge house? No, we don't. We need a small place that's just perfect for us as we're heading in towards our retirement years. Now, in retrospect, I was not growing orchids at the time that I designed and built my house. So I think it might have been nice if perhaps I would have added another room onto the house to hold the orchids. But that's why my orchids grow in my living spaces. And I really think I do love that a lot better because they're here. I get to see them every day. I don't have to go into a special room of the house. My friends and family come over and they can see the orchids. I find it's a lot easier to just sort of randomly walk through my living areas and have a peek in on each one every day and see how they're doing. And it's just super fabulous when you've got a lot of them in flower, because inside your house you have all these beautiful flowers, and I get a lot of compliments from people that come over, particularly if they've come over to the house for the first time and they're unaware of what 400 orchids look like in your living spaces. So it is a lot of work, a lot of fiddly moving stuff here and there. I've been thinking on getting a step counter to see how many steps I take within my own home, carrying these orchids from their grow spaces to the sink and then back to their grow spaces, because I think it might be quite a bit more than I'm thinking it is. So I'm hoping you guys are enjoying, seeing sort of what I do and how I care for my plants, and sort of the different challenges and things that orchid growers go through. And not always are the orchid growing challenges directly related to problems with the plant. As I mentioned, my orchid growing challenge, the biggest one that I feel I have, is trying to get all 400 of my orchids watered, drained, and out of the kitchen before my husband wakes up. And on a few Saturdays, we actually have my stepdaughter with us, so then there's two people that need breakfast. So I get up pretty early on the weekend, on Saturday, to get everybody, if you will, fed, including the family. So we're going to kind of switch things around, and we're going to continue on watering the chids. All right, so it's been about 20 minutes since these little guys have been soaking in water. Now we're just going to gently pull them up and let them drain out, and try not to have the water spill into the other plants, which is why I have not completely filled this bucket, because I'm finding I'm not necessarily the best aim, and I have sometimes with some of my plants gotten the water spouting like this, and it's gone into the crown of other plants. So I don't completely fill my bucket. I just fill it about this much, so I have room for all of the water drainage. And now, why do I set them on the sink? Well, this is pumice, and it does hold quite a bit of water in there, and I do find that if I put them right back on the shelves, gravity happens, and then their water reservoir gets overfilled, and they start leaking on my shelves. Let them sit over there and drain, while the new plants are getting watered and soaking. And as I mentioned, they're going to sit on the table there until it's time to put them back on their shelves. Now, why am I doing that? Because the way I have my shelves arranged, I have the bigger plants towards the back of the shelves and the smaller ones towards the front of the shelves. And it's just easier to have everything kind of out here in the kitchen and then put them back away, the bigger plants to the back of the shelves first. So my table is going to be quite full of orchids. Now, there is one thing I'd like to point out that I do with my plants that are in this semi-hydro setup, and that is mostly in regards to the drainage holes and their name tag. You may have heard this from other growers, but I find it's easier to remember where your holes are if you put the name tag where your holes are at, and that also helps you to keep from accidentally, if you use this sort of watering method, from getting water all over your other plants that are in your container that could possibly get down into the leaf joins and cause rot. So a good idea if you're doing semi-hydro setup is to have your tag where your holes are, and that way you can avoid any possible mishaps. Now, in my climate in Western Australia, summers are very dry, very, very dry, with relative humidity levels in the house being sub 20%. I do supplement my grow space in the bedroom with a humidifier, but I find that using this pumice, it maintains enough moisture around the plant, like a little microclimate, and lots of these little pots together do create little shelf microclimates where there's a subtle bump in the humidity levels, and keeping all of the plants in the shelves in one general area. It is a bit of a struggle to keep humidity levels up. In the heat of summer, I have to refill my humidifier on a daily basis. In the rainy season, the start and the end of the rainy seasons, I might have to refill the humidifier once, twice a week. And in the heart of winter, when it's raining a lot, I don't have to run my humidifier, because I can keep wintertime relative humidity in the house at the same amount that I can keep it during the rest of the year with humidifier running. And that just goes to show the differences and challenges that different people in the world face with their particular growing environment. Now, obviously, if I was living in some beautiful tropical country, say Indonesia, Thailand, we'll go over to the other side of the world, Central South America, Hawaii, I would not have these problems. Now, even if I was back home in Illinois, where I used to live, we had very high humidity levels there. But here in Western Australia, in the outer northern suburbs of Perth, it's only a little bit of a drive before you're in pretty well bush, desert, scrub-like conditions. And it's very difficult here. And it was quite challenging to sort of learn how to provide what my plants needed in this environment, because there are a lot of swings, heavy swings in relative humidity, big swings in temperature. As I mentioned earlier in this week, we were pushing 40 degrees Celsius, and yesterday we were 25. So I'm not real good with the Fahrenheit conversions. And before we put this one on the sink to drain, I just would like to point out, look at that nice flower spike. Now I bought this one as a little tiny seedling plant from one of the very few nurseries over east in eastern states of Australia that have the appropriate certification to ship plants into Western Australia. And I got this one back in March of 2021, and it's proceeded to grow this new bulb for me, and now it's growing its first ever flower spike. Now I've seen these on other growers' channels. It's Brassia Shelob. It's a fairly common and I think fairly easy orchid to find, but I'm super happy that I've figured this one out well enough to get it to bloom, because these oncidiums I keep in my bedroom because I typically like a bit more humidity, and I do grow underneath lights as opposed to sunlight. Again, Western Australian sun is much more intense than any sun I've experienced anywhere else in the world. I can't say I'm a worldly traveler, but I have several different geographical areas within the United States, Central America, and now here in Australia. And I can say that Australia's climate here in WA is the most extreme, having the most extreme fluctuations in utter complete parched dryness and very nice wet and humid. So it's really quite an interesting state and let me rephrase that. It's quite an interesting area of the state of Western Australia to grow in, because Western Australia is a huge state. I think you could fit a couple of Texases into Western Australia. And if you go from north to south in Western Australia, you go from, in the very most northern parts of it, and I'm saying that that's about an 8, 9, 10-hour drive north from where I'm at, you'll have some sort of tropical areas, and then as you drive further from the topmost north area of WA down south, it slowly becomes a bit more deserty, and then you get the city of Perth starting to come in, and then as you head further south, it becomes much more cool and temperate. And if you're all the way down at the bottom, the most southern portion of Western Australia, down by Albany, it's actually quite cold, and it can snow there, and they do occasionally get dustings of snow, but those people there can grow your cool growers much better than I can. Likewise, if you go from west to east, so starting from the ocean to the west of me and then heading east towards the mainland, when you head towards the hills, because there's the hills that sort of happen, and then on the other side of the hills is where the big desert, the Great Sandy, really starts to come into play, the Nullarbor. And again, as you're going there, the people that live by the hills are pretty blessed again with cooler, more temperate, and we'll call it stable weather patterns throughout there. And I would say that if you're going east to the hills from my location, okay, so my location is, I'm about a 15-minute drive from the beach, from the coast. And if I were to drive, say, to the suburb called Midland, and Midland would be a 45-minute drive due east of here, and then a bit further past Midland towards, say, Roleystone or other little areas like that, there's a visible difference in the flora and the fauna. And it's just amazing to me how different one state in Australia, the differences it can have in its humidity, its weather, the look of its flora and fauna, and it's just a fascinating state to live in. Now I'm going to briefly mention the native orchids here. So Western Australia has a bunch of beautiful terrestrial native orchids, and some of them even grow in my little area, but to get to see a lot of them, it requires me to drive 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours to get to their growing locations. And it's just because the different kinds of terrestrial orchids we have here grow well in the different sort of microclimates that are available throughout Western Australia, heading north to south and west to east. If you grow in Western Australia, it's very important that you figure out just sort of where you're at in those areas so that you're growing the correct kind of orchids. Now, if I were living in Albany, I would have no problem at all growing your colder orchids. So I would probably have a lot more Miltoniopsis and some Masdevallias, maybe a Dracula or two because of the temperature changes there. But if I were to, say, go up a little bit more north from me, say to Kalgoorlie or someplace like that, then I would really, really struggle growing anything that needs high humidity, because up that direction it becomes much more arid. So I'm sort of stuck in the middle, stuck in the middle again, particularly where I'm at. You get those real polarizing, we'll call it polarizing changes in ambient humidity levels within WA, and we get the most right here because we're just sort of stuck between the ocean, the hills. We're not quite north enough to be desert, not quite south enough to be cold, so we sort of get that weird in the middle thing. It does take quite a bit of adapting through the year to care for these orchids because of how extreme the climate changes in my area. So now I would say that the most important thing to do in growing orchids in your climate is to research your orchids, find out where they grow, what suits them best, and then figure out how to provide that for them in your climate, or to just grow orchids that grow better in your known growing conditions. There are a lot of growers here in Western Australia, very good growers that belong to our different orchid societies that do a lot of very good growing in their greenhouses and shade houses. And they've got them all very nicely set up with the automatic watering, air conditioning, heating, ventilations. I don't have room on my property to accommodate a greenhouse or a shade house, and so I don't grow outside for one reason. And for another reason, I'm just going to say that here in Western Australia, spring and fall time is the time when the bugs come out en masse. And before growing the orchids, I was a bit shocked at how many bugs just all of a sudden magically appear in spring. And when I say biblical-like levels of bugs, I mean that. I've had my very large elephant ear plant decimated over a matter of a few weeks by caterpillars that just appeared out of nowhere. And there was millions of them, not literally millions, but there were so many of them, I couldn't keep up with them. And that's when I decided, you know, these orchids are an investment. They're not cheap. To take care of them well, I didn't want to expose them to that. I've never seen one plant have, 500-600 caterpillars just munching away on it. But that's what we have here. So that's part of the reason why I grow in the house. So I grow in my house because A, my backyard is quite small. B, the pests are insane, absolutely insane levels of pests. And I struggle keeping them out of the house. And particularly in summertime, the problem with the pests is they're attracted to the plants because of the moisture in the plants. I have seen, the big, huge brown cockroaches that I know them as American cockroaches in Florida. I think they're called palmetto bugs. I have seen them come in the house and land on my freshly watered orchids and ignore the orchid themselves, but try to drink the little bit of ambient or residual water that's stuck between the media because they're dying of thirst. Likewise, I've had ants come in to the house and they don't come in to get anything other than water. So what I'm doing now in summertime is I just put a little thing of water out, not for the dogs, not for the cats. They have their water in the house, and they have a doggy and cat door to come in and out. But I leave them out there to hope that the bugs will be attracted to that water to drink and not come in my house. Because like I said, this is a very different and unusual climate compared to most. So those ones are the next ones to go in, and those ones are the ones that are soaking. So we'll be back in about 20 more minutes. So you can see the top shelves where my Onsyndium alliances are fairly empty. This is why I do the whole table thing, because these plants are the next ones to go in. And then once every one of these has drained, they'll come back onto the shelves, and I'll be able to start working on our lower shelves. Now those are the slipper orchids, and again, as I mentioned, those will get watered at a later time with less parts per million. Today there's just watering. We're working on this grouping of shelves here. So that is flower spike on my top shelf, no ID foul, given to me by my friend Kate. The sarcos are getting watered, and all of the rest of these are slowly going to make their way into the watering. And we haven't begun at all yet doing the corner shelves. This usually takes me roughly all day, because in a few hours the husband will wake up, and then I'll have to pause a bit so he can get breakfast and everything going. But this is my normal routine. Table full of orchids, my wonderful Ninja Orchid coffee cup to keep me highly caffeinated and energized to water all of these. Sink full of orchids draining, orchids waiting to go for their dip, and orchids getting their drink on. Fatso is having her morning chill. This tray is heavy. Okay, and again, we're back to just the rinse and repeat. Put the orchids on the shelf, wait for those to soak, let them drain, put them on the table. So now we've got all of the orchids off of the top shelf, which means after those get their drink, we can start putting things back onto the top shelf. Now, I watered the babies yesterday, and they all seem to be doing quite well. It's not quite time for all of the grow lights to come on. They'll come on at about 11:30. The paths and the frags will get their drink last. So once I put the top shelf orchids back on, we're going to complete these shelves, everything that's in pumice, and then we'll complete this shelving unit of everything that is in pumice. And then the last things to get their drink will be the few that I still have in bark. Now I just want to point out, look at the colors on this Sarcosinia. Beautiful. Alrighty guys, so thank you so much for watching. It's now 9:45 in the morning. I'm hoping I'm done by noon-ish. That depends on how long the husband sleeps in. So I try to keep quiet in the morning so he can get asleep. And I water all of my chids. And it does seem like a lot of work to take them off the shelves, bring them all to the kitchen, water them and drain them. And it is a lot of work, but it's quite rewarding because you get to look at each and every individual plant and it gives you an idea of how things are going along. So I want to point out here, we've got another spike coming. And this is my Nicotes Sanderiana. And you can see we've got curly leaves on this thing. And my jewel orchids kind of struggle because they need a bit more humidity than I can get them. But they're still doing good. I'm not sure what's going on right there. I think there's a little hole in it. I think I might have accidentally damaged it. So we'll leave you guys today. I thank you very much for watching. This is my encyclia that has been in bloom for what seems like forever. It's also known as the octopus orchid. We've still got buds forming. So if you like the video, please give me a thumbs up. If you'd like to see how things are continuing in my collection, a subscribe would be great. I thank you all again for watching, and everybody have a happy, healthy, and safe weekend.